The Once and Future Present, Episode 35, The War at Home and the Road to Peace. Welcome back to The Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast from Hammer History Productions. I'm your host, Casey Brooks, and today we're continuing our look at the First World War. This time, not from the trenches, but from the homes, factories, and streets of Europe. With me are Dr. Morgan and Professor Theo. Last time, we focused on the soldiers' experience and the stalemate on the front lines. Today, I want to understand how that same war transformed everyday life back home. Dr. Morgan, what did total war mean for the people back home? Welcome back to the Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast from Hammer History Productions. I'm your host, Casey Brooks, and today we're continuing our look at the First World War. This time, not from the trenches, but from the homes, factories, and streets of Europe. With me are Dr. Morgan and Professor Theo. Dr. Morgan, what did total war mean for the people back home?
Great question, Casey. The war didn't just take place on battlefields. It reached into every household. Governments redirected their economies toward the war effort, transforming civilian life into an extension of the front lines. Food, coal, and raw materials were rationed. Civilian factories converted to produce weapons, uniforms, and shells, and the state took unprecedented control of the economy to ensure that soldiers were fed and armed.
So people really felt the war in their daily lives.
Absolutely. It changed gender roles, work patterns, and even class relations. Millions of men left for the front, so women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. In Britain and France, women worked in munitions factories, on trams, in offices, and even on farms as part of the Women's Land Army. Their wages were still lower than men's, but for many working-class women, it was their first experience of financial independence.
That sounds like a huge social change. Did it last after the war?
Some of it did, but much of it was temporary. Governments often expected women to leave those jobs when men returned. Still, the war gave women visibility. In Britain, women over 30 gained the right to vote in 1918, partly in recognition of their wartime contribution. In Germany and Austria, universal suffrage followed after the war. The conflict didn't create gender equality, but it accelerated it.
And let's not forget how the war altered the working class. Labor was in short supply, so wages rose, especially for skilled workers in arms production. Trade unions gained political leverage, as governments needed to avoid strikes that could halt production. In Britain, the government even worked with union leaders to set wage standards and negotiate disputes.
So the war actually improved conditions for some workers?
In the short term, yes, though inflation eroded many of those gains. People were earning more money, but basic goods were scarce and prices high. The stress of constant shortages bred resentment, especially as the war dragged into its third and fourth years.
The longer the war lasted, the more social strains appeared. In France and Germany, soldiers at the front began to feel disconnected from civilians who couldn't understand the horror they faced. And civilians, exhausted by rationing and loss, started questioning whether the sacrifices were worth it. By 1917, strikes and protests erupted across Europe.
Were those the same years that soldiers started mutinying?
Exactly. The most famous example was the French Army Mutiny of 1917. After years of brutal fighting and a disastrous offensive ordered by General Nivelle, tens of thousands of French soldiers refused to go back into battle. They weren't rebelling against France itself. They just wanted the killing to stop. The French government responded harshly, executing some mutineers, but also improving conditions, rotating troops more frequently, and promising no more suicidal offensives.
That must have terrified leaders across Europe.
It did. Governments feared revolution as much as defeat. And for good reason. By 1917, socialist uprisings were spreading. In Germany, strikes over food shortages merged with anti-war demonstrations. The Spartacus League, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, called for an end to the capitalist war. Even within the army, morale was collapsing.
Was this happening everywhere or mostly in the Central Powers?
mostly there, though every country felt the strain. Austria-Hungary was falling apart under ethnic divisions, and the Ottoman Empire faced rebellions. But even among the Allies, unity was fragile. In Britain, for example, opposition to the war grew among socialists, Irish nationalists, and Indian independence activists.
Right. The British Empire was global. How did the war affect its colonies?
The empire depended on its colonies for troops and resources. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served overseas, fighting in the Middle East and Africa. Indian nationalists supported the war at first, hoping it would earn them self-government. But when those promises were broken, resentment deepened. The Indian National Congress began pushing harder for independence. Meanwhile, in Ireland, anger over the delay of Home Rule led to the Easter Rising of 1916. It was crushed, but the executions of its leaders turned public opinion sharply against British rule.
So even the so-called victors were struggling at home.
Exactly. Britain's massive debt, food shortages, and colonial unrest were signs that the empire's foundations were cracking. France was exhausted, Italy faced riots, and Germany was near collapse. By 1917, all sides were desperate for something to change.
Before we get to the United States entering the war, I've heard that right around the end of the conflict, another deadly event swept across the world, the Spanish flu. How did that connect to the war itself?
That's an excellent point, Casey. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919 killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide, more than the war itself. Troop movements and crowded military camps helped the disease spread across continents. Soldiers brought it home, infecting civilians weakened by malnutrition and stress. Governments censored reports to maintain morale, so people often didn't realize the scale of the danger until it was too late.
The pandemic deepened the sense of despair. Imagine surviving years of war, only to see friends and family fall ill just as peace seemed near. It was as if the world had been cursed with a second wave of suffering. In some places, it even paralyzed post-war reconstruction efforts.
So the war and the flu together created one of the most devastating periods in modern history.
Exactly. The combination of military loss, hunger, and disease reshaped entire societies.
And that's when the United States entered the war, right?
Correct. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. The immediate reason was Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which sank ships carrying American passengers and goods. The Zimmermann Telegram, a secret German message proposing an alliance with Mexico, fueled outrage in the U.S. Wilson framed the war as a fight to make the world safe for democracy.
The arrival of American troops and supplies changed everything. It boosted Allied morale and convinced Germany that time was running out. But by that point, the human cost was staggering. Millions dead, economies shattered, and societies transformed.
So how did the war finally end?
The final phase came in 1918. With Russia out of the war after its revolution, Germany launched a massive spring offensive on the Western Front, hoping to win before American forces could fully arrive. For a moment, it looked like they might succeed, but the Allies held firm. The Second Battle of the Marne in July 1918 marked the turning point. Allied counterattacks, powered by fresh American troops, pushed the Germans back.
By the fall of 1918, the Central Powers were crumbling. Bulgaria surrendered first, then the Ottoman Empire, and finally Austria-Hungary. In Germany, strikes and mutinies spread from the navy to the cities. The Kaiser abdicated on November 9, and a new Republican government signed the armistice 2 days later, on November 11, 1918. The guns fell silent at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. But even before peace arrived, civilians across Eastern Europe and the Ottoman territories were experiencing atrocities that would mark some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. One of the most devastating was the Armenian genocide of 1915-1917, in which the Ottoman government deported and massacred over 1 million Armenians, an event many historians regard as the first modern genocide. Ethnic violence also flared in the Balkans and along collapsing imperial borders, where nationalist and ethnic tensions turned neighbor against neighbor. The war's disintegration of empires often unleashed violence against minority communities who were blamed for defeat or rebellion.
It must have felt like the world was holding its breath.
It did. People hoped the peace would bring stability, but instead it brought new conflicts over what kind of world should follow. President Wilson introduced his 14 points, calling for national self-determination, free trade, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars.
But not everyone shared Wilson's optimism. France wanted security and revenge, Britain wanted to preserve its empire, and Italy demanded territorial rewards. At the Paris Peace Conference, these competing visions collided. The resulting Treaty of Versailles punished Germany harshly, taking away colonies, limiting its military, and demanding huge reparations. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, placed sole responsibility for the war on Germany and its allies.
That must have caused anger in Germany.
Enormous anger. Many Germans saw the treaty as a humiliation. They argued that all nations had contributed to the war's outbreak, yet only Germany was blamed. The economic burden of reparations and the psychological blow of defeat would haunt the new Weimar Republic for years.
And beyond Europe, the treaty redrew borders across the globe. The Ottoman Empire's lands were divided into new mandates under British and French control. This division followed the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, in which Britain and France had already planned to carve up the Middle East into zones of influence long before the war ended. Under the post-war mandate system, Britain took control of Iraq and Palestine, while France governed Syria and Lebanon. Many Arabs, who had fought alongside the Allies during the war with hopes of independence, felt betrayed by these arrangements. Western Europe and the United States now played a dominant role in shaping the modern Middle East, often prioritizing oil, trade routes, and strategic interests over promises of self-determination. Colonies in Africa and Asia were also handed to the victors as mandates rather than true independence. One striking example came from Southeast Asia, where a young Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh traveled to Paris hoping to present a petition for Vietnamese independence. He believed Wilson's language about self-determination would apply to colonized peoples, but his plea was ignored by the major powers. This moment planted the seeds of anti-colonial resistance that would echo through the 20th century, culminating decades later in the Vietnam War. The promise of self-determination inspired hope, but delivered frustration for colonized peoples.
Before we wrap up, I'm curious about the League of Nations that Wilson proposed. Did people really believe it could prevent another war?
Many did, at least at first. The League was envisioned as a global organization where nations could resolve disputes peacefully. Wilson hoped it would embody his idea of collective security. If one nation threatened peace, the others would act together to stop it. But there was a major problem. The United States never joined. The U.S. Senate rejected the treaty, arguing it would drag America into future European conflicts. Without the world's most powerful democracy on board, the League's authority was weakened from the start.
And in Europe, support for the League was mixed. Some saw it as a hopeful experiment in international cooperation, while others viewed it as an unrealistic dream built on wartime exhaustion. In hindsight, its failure to enforce peace during the 1930s proved how fragile that post-war idealism really was.
So even peace left behind inequality and resentment.
Exactly. The war may have ended on the battlefield, but its social and political shocks were only beginning. The next years would bring revolution, economic hardship, and a questioning of everything Europeans once believed about progress and civilization.
And that's where we'll pick up next time, with revolution in Russia and the birth of a new world order. Dr. Morgan, Professor Theo, thank you both for guiding us through this turbulent chapter.
Always a pleasure, Casey.
Thank you, Casey.
And thanks to all of you for listening to The Once and Future Present, Episode 35, The War at Home and the Road to Peace. Join us next time for Episode 36 as we explore how the Great War gave rise to revolution and the dawn of a new ideological age. As always, stay curious and think critically.